This is my colleague Andre Sorensen, who's a geographer here at the University of Toronto Scarborough, and we're going to ask Andre a few questions about the role of cities in the origins and development of capitalism. Andre, let me start by asking you about the role that cities played in that first stage of capitalist development, the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and the way in which urban places became important sites of economic activity.
Right. Well, the key thing there is in the 12th and 13th centuries, there was a huge expansion of urban population associated with increasing trade. Somewhat increased security had allowed huge growth of the amount of intercity trade, and that allowed a concentration of capital by merchants and creation of lots of work in these emerging cities, like in Flanders, in the Italian city-states, and population growth overall was happening in that couple of centuries, but particularly since the cities were growing, they attracted a lot of people from the rural hinterlands who were taking advantage of escaping serfdom and gaining the liberties of cities. It was quite uneven at how this worked out in different places, but a common rule was that if you could stay in a city for a year and a day, then you became a citizen and were free of the previous serf condition of living in the rural areas. So cities grew rapidly. There was this concentration of capital and a huge expansion of industrial or sort of craft industrial production in the city centers, mostly in textiles, mostly in the wool industries, that was production for export.
Great. So if we now look at the second stage of capitalist development, what we can refer to as the Industrial Revolution, and plot chronologically, at least in Europe, from the mid-19th century onwards, I understand that cities become far more important as nodes of all sorts of economic activity and new sorts of activities. Could you say a little bit about that second stage?
Right. And of course, compared to that earlier stage of 400 or 500 years earlier, this is a much larger scale. I mean, it really is the Industrial Revolution. You're seeing the expansion from pretty small enterprises of some hundreds of people, or dozens of people, to giant industries powered by steam and manufacturing. Again, textile industries were one of the really leading edges, but also iron, steel, machine making, railways. And so there were giant enterprises employing thousands of workers. So again, it was creating jobs on a very large scale in the big industrial centers. Initially Britain, but then spreading Germany, France, the US was also a leader. And so again, it was a period of really rapid growth of cities. And what's particularly interesting in the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century is that the scale of growth and the rapidity of population growth completely overwhelmed the traditional infrastructures and modes of governance and regulation that had allowed medieval and early cities to survive. So there were huge environmental problems in 19th century industrial cities. Pollution, but also lack of clean water supply. Before this, most cities had relied on wells. There were no sewers. There were no regulations over industry really at all, or in building. So there were just horrific environmental problems caused by industrialization, but also by rapid growth and impoverishment of working class people. Workers were paid very, very little, subsistence or often less. And there was no transit systems at all. People had to walk to work. So there's incredible crowding in really pretty dilapidated housing in the city centers that caused just horrific living conditions and really terrible outbreaks of disease, cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, and created a real crisis in the large cities of that period.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, let me give you an opportunity to say a little bit about city studies at UTSC and how students taking a history course might want to think about following this up with some of the courses offered through the City Studies program.
Right. Yeah, City Studies is quite a really strong program at UTSC. It has a whole set of about 25 courses that look at a range of different topics. But many of them really take a historical perspective. I mean, we really see cities or understand cities as having evolved over time. And so the temporal evolution and understanding of how urban systems develop is actually really important in city studies. So, but also just cities are central to our contemporary society. So understanding, how cities are governed, how communities work, how we regulate cities, how urban social movements have influenced governance is really important for understanding contemporary society. So it makes a nice match with history.